Hola? What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
Before the ceremony, while the rest of the bridal party buzzed around pretending everything was perfect and polished, my brother leaned in just close enough for only me to hear, flashing that smug little smirk he's worn since we were kids and muttered, "Hope you don't ruin this day like you do everything." And just like that, all those years of biting my tongue, nodding through the humiliation, swallowing every insult with a fake smile, it all tightened in my chest like a fist. I didn't say a word, I didn't flinch. Just blinked, turned my face, and let him think he won again. That's what Matt always wanted. Victory in silence. But this time was different. This time I'd already played my move. It was the night before his wedding, and I was standing on the edge of the venue's backyard, watching the sun smear orange across the lake, my hands clenched behind my back. The rehearsal had gone off with only one minor hiccup, which Diane, my mother, or rather Matt's most dedicated fan club president, immediately blamed on me, of course. I'd been asked to stand in the wrong spot during the ceremony walkthrough. The wedding planner had gestured vaguely, I'd hesitated, and boom, chaos, drama, tension, and in that one breath, Diane had found her scapegoat. Again, I heard her sharp whisper behind me, just loud enough for the bridesmaids to hear. "She just can't help herself, can she?" It wasn't even new. That was her favorite line about me, one she'd been repeating since I was 12 and accidentally dropped Matt's birthday cake. It was easier for her to believe that I was broken than to admit she'd spent 2 decades letting her golden boy get away with everything. I kept my eyes on the lake, pretending not to hear the way the group snickered behind me, pretending not to notice Sophie's awkward half smile. She didn't join in, but she didn't stop it either. She was marrying into the family after all. Best not to make waves. When I was 16, I took the fall for Matt when he crashed Dad's Buick into the neighbor's fence after a party. He was drunk, I was sober, but he cried, swore he'd lose his scholarship if the cops found out, and Mom already had her mind made up. "Matt has a future," she'd said. "Jenna, you've always been the strong one. You'll bounce back." She told me that like it was a compliment. Like being the one who bounces back meant something other than always being the one left to clean up the mess. He never thanked me. Not for the car, not for the money I lent him in my 20s, not for the job interview I set up through my friend when he lost his marketing gig and begged me not to tell Mom. Every favor I did for him just disappeared into this void of entitlement he lived in. And every time he succeeded, the family clapped like trained seals, proud of the prodigal son who always found a way, while I sat in the corner biting down on truth like it was poison. Last year, he called me from some motel in upstate New York, claiming he was just taking time to get his head right and needed a little help to get back on track. His cards were maxed out, and he didn't want Sophie to worry. I paid his bill. Again, no thanks, no mention, just a Venmo request gone unanswered. Then 6 months later, I got a wedding invitation with my name misspelled on the envelope and a note asking if I'd be willing to do something simple, like the gift table or the guest book, just something you can handle. It was right after that phone call, when I sat alone in my kitchen with the invitation clutched in my hand and my bank account freshly drained, that I decided, if I was going to be invisible, then fine, I'd stay invisible, but this time I'd leave something behind. Not a scene, not a speech, not some dramatic explosion. No, that would just feed into the image they all had of me, the unstable, emotional sister. This time I'd leave proof. A quiet, undeniable truth they couldn't ignore or twist. As the sun dipped lower, I turned and walked to my car parked just off the gravel drive. I slid into the front seat, shut the door, and popped open the glove box. Nestled inside was a small velvet box, the kind that usually holds jewelry, though this one didn't contain anything so decorative. I opened it, checked the metal plate inside one last time. The engraving caught the last of the sunlight, and I traced my finger over the words, feeling the weight of them press against my skin. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about balance, about putting something back in the world that should have been there all along. Accountability, a simple plaque, a name, a date, No more hiding, no more pretending. I closed the box, slid it into a larger envelope, already addressed and sealed, and tucked it into a paper gift bag, with tissue neatly arranged on top. The planner would be collecting gifts tomorrow morning before the ceremony, and mine would be opened in private, in the bridal suite, just after Sophie got her makeup done. I shut the glove box, took a breath, and looked at myself in the rearview mirror. I didn't look vengeful, I didn't look angry, I looked tired, but calm, like someone who'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to see her worth, and decided to show it just once, in a way they'd never forget. Matt thought he'd get through this wedding like he always did, untouched, unchallenged, unbothered. But the truth has a funny way of sneaking in, even when you've silenced every voice trying to speak it. And this time it was coming in wrapped in gold foil and tissue paper. Tomorrow the whole room would clap for him, smile for the camera, and toast to his happiness, but I'd be the one giving the most memorable gift of the day. And not even he could ruin that. The morning of the wedding started the way most family gatherings in my life have begun, under a fragile sheet of artificial civility, stretched too tight across years of buried resentment, passive-aggressive glances, and secrets no one dared speak aloud unless they were doing it behind someone else's back. I arrived at the pre-wedding brunch hosted at a quaint country inn. Sophie's parents had rented for the weekend. The space was full of over-polished furniture, clinking champagne flutes, and faces trained to perform warmth. And I walked in with the same resigned caution I'd learned to carry through every family event since I was old enough to recognize the hierarchy. As soon as I entered, I could feel it. That subtle shift in the air when my mother saw me and smiled that tight, uncomfortable smile she always wore when she had to acknowledge me in public, like I was some obligation she couldn't quite shake, but wished she could keep tucked behind a curtain. Diane walked over, arms outstretched for a hug that lasted precisely long enough to fulfill social expectations and no longer, then said in that shrill voice coated with forced excitement, "Oh, Jenna, you made it. Good, we've got your seat ready." And then she gestured not toward the long rustic dining table where Matt and the rest of the family were already seated, but toward a tiny bistro table in the corner, one of those little afterthought tables they use when the seating chart runs out of space. It would have been almost funny if it wasn't so calculated. I paused, gave her a slow nod, and walked to the table without comment. It was set for two, but no one joined me. The second seat remained empty through the whole meal, as if they'd wanted the appearance of inclusion without the risk of actual conversation. I sipped my orange juice, ignored the egg white frittata I hadn't asked for, and scanned the room where Matt held court at the center of attention, laughing with Sophie's father like he'd known the man for years, rather than just a few strategically pleasant dinners. Matt had always known how to make people like him, even when he was lying straight through his teeth. And it wasn't just charm. He had a gift for turning his messes into stories that made him look both victimized and valiant, like when he got caught cheating on his college exams and somehow convinced our parents it was the professor's fault for being unfair and biased, or the time he drained his savings in a failed investment and told everyone he'd been helping a friend in need, and our mother nodded proudly like he was some kind of hero. It was the same charm he used to make sure no one questioned how Sophie's dream honeymoon to Italy, an extravagance no one thought twice about, was even possible when he was barely keeping up with his car payments 8 months ago, and I sat there, watching him work the room, and let my mind wander back to the day I found the unpaid notice on his counter, the one for his overdue rent, the one he swore he'd take care of. I'd been at his apartment dropping off a care package, something Diane had guilted me into doing. He was at rock bottom again, supposedly, though you wouldn't have known it from the new watch on his wrist, or the way he still ordered delivery like he had stock in Uber Eats. That day, I'd paid his rent, covered the last of the balance on his honeymoon flights. His desperation had sounded real enough on the phone, and against my better judgment, I'd tapped into my own savings. I told myself it was the last time. And maybe it was, but back then, I still clung to some ragged hope that if I just did enough, gave enough, eventually they'd stop treating me like the family footnote. My phone buzzed under the table, interrupting my thoughts. A text from my cousin Margot. "Why aren't you at the main table?" I didn't answer. What would I say? That I'd been deliberately seated at a distance so I couldn't disrupt the perfect narrative Diane had curated around her son's big day? That I was, once again, the invisible sibling only invited for appearances? No, I silenced the phone, folded my napkin, and looked up just in time to catch the end of a whispered conversation between Sophie and my mother. They were standing near the mimosa bar, both facing away from me, but I recognized the tone in their voices. The kind of lowered pitch people use when they're talking about someone they don't want to hear them. And then, just before Sophie walked away, I heard my name. Sophie leaned in closer to Diane, gave her a wary glance, and said, "Are you sure she's stable enough for today?" It was low, almost inaudible, but not to me, and the way Diane nodded, without hesitation, without even a flicker of defense, confirmed it. That's how they spoke about me when I wasn't in the room. That's what they told each other. And that's when it hit me, not the pain, because that had dulled long ago, but the clarity. They didn't see me as broken. They needed me to be, because if I wasn't, if I had done nothing wrong, then everything they'd said, everything they'd excused, every lie Matt had told about me to cover his own ass would come crumbling down. My reputation as the unstable sister was their insurance policy, the thing that let them sleep at night while rewarding him for manipulation, dressed up as charisma. I stood up, slow and calm, and walked out the back door of the inn, not bothering to say goodbye. Outside, the morning was cool, the kind of soft breeze that carried spring pollen and the scent of fresh-cut grass. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folded copy of the honeymoon confirmation. My name on the billing details. The receipt still crisp, untouched. I'd printed it weeks ago. I'd kept it. Not out of spite, but for this moment. For the day someone asked me to prove I wasn't crazy. They thought they had today scripted. Every line rehearsed. Every illusion polished. But I wasn't the problem anymore. I was the truth they didn't plan for. And very soon, that truth would be sitting quietly inside a velvet box wrapped like any other gift, just waiting for someone to open it and realize what it meant. The morning of the wedding broke with the kind of quiet stillness that always seems to hover just before something changes irreversibly, like the pause between a breath drawn in anger and the words that finally, inevitably, come spilling out. The estate grounds were blanketed in soft sunlight, with rows of white chairs, already arranged in a semicircle facing the lake, and pastel floral arrangements perched neatly along every aisle, perfect down to the last petal. It was beautiful in that overly curated, Instagram-ready kind of way that Matt had always liked, charming on the outside, hollow in places you couldn't photograph. I arrived early, as requested by the planner, who'd emailed the wedding party the week before with a passive-aggressive reminder to please be punctual, though I had no doubt the comment was meant only for me, as if I were still the same teenager who'd once shown up 20 minutes late to Matt's high school graduation after missing the train, something that had become a running family joke, an eternal reminder that Jenna just can't get it right. I parked my car at the far edge of the gravel lot and sat there for a long while, watching through the windshield as various relatives and friends trickled in, all dressed in their muted formal wear, smiles plastered on like wallpaper, just enough to maintain appearances, not quite enough to convince anyone with a decent sense of emotional eyesight. I adjusted my dress in the rearview mirror, ran a hand down the side of my hair to smooth the flyaways, and opened the glove box with steady fingers. There it was, the paper gift bag I had prepared the night before, simple but elegant, filled with carefully arranged tissue, a handwritten card, and, nestled at the very bottom, a velvet box containing what would become the most significant object of the entire day. When I walked across the courtyard and into the main hall where the wedding coordinator was directing vendors with military precision, no one noticed me at first. I approached the gift table, where wrapped boxes and monogrammed gift bags were already accumulating like some kind of tribute to the golden couple, and I handed my bag to the young assistant standing nearby, giving her very specific instructions. I told her, politely but firmly, that this particular gift was meant to go to the bridal suite and should be delivered before the ceremony. She glanced at the label, raised an eyebrow, then nodded with that kind of rehearsed compliance they teach in hospitality training. I smiled, thanked her, and walked away, not looking back. It wasn't flashy, this gift of mine. It didn't sparkle or hum or announce itself with any sort of dramatic flourish. And yet, beneath its modest exterior, it carried something heavier than anything else in the room: a reckoning. I wasn't trying to ruin the wedding, no matter how much Matt might claim otherwise later. I wasn't out to steal the spotlight or humiliate him in front of Sophie's family. That would have been too easy, too messy, too obvious. What I wanted was much simpler. I wanted the truth to sit in Sophie's hands like a weight she couldn't ignore. I wanted her to feel it, cold metal, undeniable. And I wanted Matt to realize, perhaps for the first time in his carefully insulated life, that actions do leave echoes, and sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy. The engraving on the metal plate had taken weeks to get just right. It wasn't just the words, it was the spacing, the font, the placement, all chosen with care, meant to look formal but not sentimental, official but not spiteful. It read, "Honeymoon, Italy, paid in full by Jenna L., June 2nd, debt repaid, no more, no less. No accusations, no emotional appeals, just facts." The money I'd used hadn't come easily. I'd saved it over time, cutting corners where I could, giving up weekend plans and small luxuries. It wasn't even about the amount, it was the principle. I'd sacrificed for Matt when he came to me with desperation in his voice and lies on his breath, and like a fool, I'd answered. Again. Because no matter how much hurt he caused, a part of me still remembered the little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap during thunderstorms, who used to write silly notes and slide them under my door. I held on to those scraps of memory far longer than I should have, long after he'd grown into someone who used kindness only as currency, only when it bought him something. I walked back out to the terrace and took my seat among the other guests, and for the first time in years, I felt no bitterness, no rage, just resolve. The ceremony hadn't even begun yet, but the real turning point was already in motion, quietly unfolding upstairs where Sophie was getting ready, her hair being pinned, her dress zipped, her makeup touched up while her world, though she didn't know it yet, was about to tilt just slightly, permanently. I caught sight of Matt through the glass doors. He was standing with his groomsmen, laughing about something, looking every inch the confident, charming groom, and for a moment I let myself observe him without the weight of history. I wondered if he'd feel it when Sophie opened the box. Would he know, in that exact moment, that something had shifted? That the scaffolding of half-truths he'd built around their relationship had developed a crack that couldn't be patched? The guests kept arriving, the music picked up, and someone called for everyone to begin taking their seats. I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked with the others toward the ceremony area, letting the warm breeze graze my face like a benediction. I hadn't told anyone what I'd done. I hadn't warned or hinted or threatened. There would be no confrontation, no dramatic reveal in front of a crowd, just a quiet detonation, unfolding in private, between bride and groom. As I took my seat near the back row, far enough to be ignored, but close enough to see, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Not petty power, not revenge disguised as justice, but genuine, grounded control. I had spoken my truth in the only language this family ever seemed to understand: receipts. The gift was wrapped, delivered, waiting. All that remained was for Sophie to open it and read the message carved not just in metal, but in every sacrifice I'd made, every injustice I'd endured, every moment I'd been told to smile and swallow my pride. The rest, as they say, was up to them, up. The moment the music began, one of those airy string quartets playing some overused pop song disguised as classical, it was as if a spell descended over the entire wedding site. softening the edges of all the carefully staged beauty and forcing every guest to sit up straighter, smile wider, and pretend they weren't just counting the minutes until the open bar. The white chairs creaked under the weight of relatives and friends dressed in their best versions of themselves, and I, seated toward the rear, almost at the edge of the manicured lawn, watched as the procession began with military efficiency, all the while wondering whether anyone else had noticed the shift in energy that passed like a ghost just moments before the ceremony started. Because I had noticed it, subtle, nearly invisible, but there, nonetheless. Sophie had not descended from the bridal suite with the same starry-eyed glee she'd worn in the engagement photos, nor with the proud glow of a woman about to marry the man she believed she knew completely. No, there was something else now. Her expression, still composed and serene enough to fool the untrained eye, had been laced with a tension I recognized all too well, something akin to realization, the kind that settles slowly and painfully, like warm water turning cold on your skin when the heat's been cut off without warning. I had spent the last 20 minutes watching the bridal party prepare for the entrance, noting the hushed whispers exchanged between Sophie's maid of honor and the wedding planner, both of whom had darted into the bridal suite and emerged a few minutes later with the stiff posture of people who had just been told a secret they wished they could forget. Matt, meanwhile, stood at the altar like he was auditioning for a toothpaste commercial, smiling just enough to seem genuine, rocking slightly on his heels like a man convinced everything would proceed exactly as planned. Because things always did for him. What he didn't see, what he couldn't possibly know, was that while he had spent his morning basking in compliments and preening for photos, Sophie had been upstairs, alone for just long enough, opening the soft tissue paper of my gift, finding the handwritten note I'd tucked in behind the velvet box, and discovering what I suspected would become the first honest truth she'd heard about the man she was about to marry. The note had been brief, deliberately sparse in detail, but it had said enough. I'd written, "I don't expect recognition, but I do expect honesty to matter. This is yours now, just know who it came from." And beneath that, nestled in the folds of white satin, had been the small metal plaque, its engraving simple but unignorable. Honeymoon, Italy, paid in full by Jenna L., June 2nd, debt repaid. It wasn't the money that mattered. It never had been. It was the story Matt had told, that he had booked the trip himself, paid in full, surprised Sophie with it over dinner one night. I knew that story because Diane had bragged about it for months. Matthew saved up for it all on his own, she had told anyone who would listen. So thoughtful. He even booked first class. But the truth, buried under layers of lies and smiling photos, was that he had called me in a panic, voice trembling with the same manipulative urgency he'd perfected over the years, asking if I could front the cost for just a little while. He had promised to pay me back before the wedding, swearing on everything from our childhood dog to Dad's memory, making it sound like the world would fall apart if I didn't say yes. And like a fool, I had agreed. Not because I believed him anymore, but because deep down, I still believed in Sophie. I didn't know her well, but I saw something in her, a sincerity Matt didn't deserve. I figured she deserved the truth, at the very least, even if it came wrapped in discomfort. So as Sophie walked down the aisle, flanked by her father, I watched her eyes, not the guests, not the flowers, not the way her train flowed behind her like a veil of clouds, but her eyes. And what I saw there was not joy, not even nerves, but something colder, sharper, more dangerous. Awareness. She reached the altar and stood before Matt, who looked at her with a grin so full of confidence it almost bordered on arrogance. And when he reached for her hands, she let him take them, but the stiffness in her fingers betrayed her. When the officiant asked if there was anyone who objected, the room chuckled lightly, as is custom. And Matt even gave a cheeky grin to his groomsmen as if to say, "We're in the clear." But Sophie didn't laugh. She didn't even flinch. She just turned slightly toward Matt, leaned in and whispered something so quietly that I, sitting 20 feet away, couldn't hear. But I didn't need to hear the words to understand the impact, because the color drained from Matt's face like water from a cracked glass. His smile faltered for the first time all day, and he blinked rapidly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like a child caught in a lie. The ceremony continued. No one made a scene, no one stormed off or shouted. But something had changed irrevocably. It was in the way Sophie kept her gaze just slightly averted, in the way she didn't laugh at his jokes during the vows, in the way her lips tightened every time he said her name. She was there, physically, but some part of her had already begun to retreat. And I, sitting alone, unnoticed, the sister pushed to the periphery of every family photo, felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not vindication exactly, not glee or spite or even satisfaction, just stillness. Like the earth had finally shifted, just a little, to correct something that had been crooked for far too long. There was no applause loud enough to drown out the silence between Sophie and Matt during the recessional. No amount of champagne or speeches or music could fill the space that had opened between them. The gift had been opened. The truth had been seen. And now, the only question left hanging in the air was what she would do with it. The reception hall was a masterpiece of decoration and illusion, adorned with towering floral arrangements, glittering candles in hurricane vases, and soft amber lights that gave every guest's face a warm, flattering glow, as if all imperfections, resentments, and regrets could be blurred into pleasant forgetfulness by the right lighting and enough Prosecco. The band played jazz standards with mechanical precision, waitstaff glided between tables like shadows, and laughter rippled across the room in curated bursts. The kind you hear when people are trying very hard to believe that everything is exactly as it should be. But beneath all the noise and beauty, beneath the layers of lace and polished silverware, there was a tension that clung to the room like humidity. Before a summer storm, thick, unspoken, and impossible to ignore, I took my seat near the corner of the room, predictably placed just far enough from the head table to remain in the background, a recurring extra in the unfolding drama of Matt's perfect day. From where I sat, I could see Sophie with startling clarity, not the Sophie from the engagement photos, not the blushing bride from the morning's aisle walk, but a woman who had been handed something sharp and unexpected on the cusp of what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and who was now quietly bleeding beneath her satin smile. She didn't look angry, not in the way some women do when they've been humiliated or betrayed. She looked like she was thinking, calculating, measuring every word, every movement, every piece of her new husband, as if trying to determine exactly what had been real and what had been rehearsed. She was polite, even gracious, during the receiving line, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, but there was a tightness around her mouth, a subtle withdrawal in her eyes every time Matt touched her arm, or leaned in to whisper something meant only for her. Matt, ever the performer, played his role with the same practiced charm he had always wielded like a shield. He laughed too loudly, gestured too broadly, and kept reaching for Sophie as if proximity could re-establish the illusion. But I could see it. Every time she pulled slightly away, every time her hand tensed under his, every time she forced a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Something had shifted, and he felt it, even if he didn't understand it yet. Dinner was served, and the clinking of glasses signaled the beginning of the speeches. Diane stood first, resplendent in her navy blue gown, her voice quivering with practiced emotion as she spoke about Matt's strong spirit, his natural leadership, and how proud she was of the man he had become. She mentioned Sophie only briefly as a lovely addition to our family, then turned the focus back to Matt's many accomplishments, painting a portrait of a son who had weathered hardship with dignity and risen above every challenge with grace. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, and listened as she spoke of his work ethic, his selflessness, the way he had saved for months to surprise Sophie with the honeymoon she'd always dreamed of. The room applauded, and Matt grinned, lifting his champagne glass toward the crowd like a conquering hero. I didn't clap. I didn't smile. I just watched Sophie. She didn't clap either. There was a brief lull after the last best man's toast, a moment of awkward silence as eyes began to scan the room, unsure if anyone else would speak. That's when I stood. It wasn't planned, I hadn't written anything, hadn't rehearsed a clever ending, or thought about how I'd be received. I just knew in that moment that if I didn't say something now, I never would. And maybe it wasn't about them anymore. Maybe it was just about me. I walked slowly toward the front, heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor, and picked up the microphone that had been left on the edge of the table. The chatter faded. Heads turned. Diane shifted uncomfortably. Matt's smile faltered. "I'll be brief," I said, my voice steady, quiet enough to make them lean in. "I'm not one for long speeches or sentimental stories, and honestly, I know my presence here today has been more tolerated than welcomed. That's fine. I've gotten used to that over the years." There were a few nervous laughs. No one dared interrupt. "I just wanted to say this," I continued. "Sometimes the most valuable gifts are the ones no one ever sees. Sometimes they don't come in wrapping paper or with fancy bows. Sometimes they're silent, invisible, and completely unnoticed. Until one day, they're not." I looked directly at Matt, then at Sophie. "To honesty," I said, raising my glass. "May we all learn to recognize it, even when it whispers instead of shouts." I set the mic down and walked back to my seat, without waiting for applause, without looking back. The room was silent for a breath longer than was comfortable. Then someone, probably a cousin, started clapping politely, and the rest followed, unsure of what they were applauding, but too conditioned not to respond. The evening continued, as weddings always do. There were more drinks, more music, more laughter forced through clenched teeth. But the atmosphere had changed. Whispers moved through the tables like smoke. People were asking questions. Had something happened? Was there drama between the siblings? Had Matt done something? The words honeymoon and paid and gift kept popping up in hushed tones. Someone had clearly opened their mouth, but not me. I hadn't needed to. Later that night, as the bouquet toss was announced, Sophie stepped forward, bouquet in hand, and stood in the center of the dance floor. The crowd of single women behind her giggled and jostled for position. She turned her head, caught my eye for just a moment, and then, without warning, walked straight past them all, bouquet still clutched in her hand, and stopped in front of me. She held the bouquet out, not with ceremony, not with flair, just an offer. "Is the note true?" she asked, voice low, eyes unreadable. I met her gaze, calm and clear. "That depends," I said. "Do you want it to be?" She stood there a moment longer, bouquet dangling at her side, then nodded slowly and walked away. I never found out what happened on their honeymoon, whether they went at all, whether they stayed in the same room, whether Sophie finally asked Matt to explain himself. But that wasn't the point. I didn't need an ending wrapped in a bow. I didn't need to see the fallout. All I needed was to know that for once, the truth had spoken louder than the lie, and this time no one could unhear it.